Just wanted to get us going here today. Welcome everybody for coming to the seminar, both in person and online. We're going to be having a talk today by Nathan Fortner. It's his final Dr. Sandell's final seminar, and it's dealing with a topic that he's looked at extensively. Nathan came to us from a position in Kansas, working on rice in Kansas as an agronomist there, and decided that he was going to be taking his career in a little bit different direction. And today it's a little bit different seminar, in that the seminar kind of lays out Nathan's kind of career plans for the next phase of his career. It's kind of a business plan for where he's planning to take his career. So it's a little bit unique in that regard. So Nathan will provide some background of himself, but again, I think as he goes through a seminar, you'll get to learn a little bit more about him. So I will turn it over to Nathan.
All right. Thanks, Dr. Hine. Just saw someone walking up. So first, let me start with defining. I kind of came up with this term, community-based development organizations, to describe small organizations, small to medium-sized organizations that are positioned within communities, well-established there, permanently operating, and with close connections to the communities that they serve. And so just want to make sure we're on the same page of what I'm talking about there, but these are small to medium-sized NGOs or nonprofits. And then give a quick bio on me. I have a wife and we have 5 kids, and one of them is here today in the back trying to not be seen too much. This is our oldest, Truman. He's 15. And last night he said, "Hey Dad, can I come with you tomorrow?" And I thought, oh, and he's kind of at that stage of life where he likes me, but he's not quite as interested in hanging out with me anymore. And so when he asked if he could come, I thought, man, oh, of course, buddy, you can come with me. so I couldn't say no. But we have 5, and this is them here. This picture is much more tranquil than real life. It's busy. I did my undergrad at Missouri State University in agronomy, and like Gary mentioned, I was a rice agronomist for a small biotech company in Kansas for 12 years, and also handled USDA regulatory for the company. And so rice is kind of my first love, and I haven't been around it in several years. So a couple of years ago, I planted some rice in my backyard in a landscape pool. So my presentation is kind of light on pictures, so I needed to get a few in here. So here's an outline of what we're going to go through. Mostly what we're concerned with is addressing future food demands, and also alleviating poverty. And generally speaking, the way we're going to do that is with research and extension. So we'll go through kind of the evolution of extension models and up to where we are today. And then also building off of extension models, what we're evolving into now with partnerships with these community-based development organizations. And so to start out with, I'll just give a kind of a snapshot of what the forecast is, the predictions are for global food demand. This was a 57-study meta-analysis of projected food demands, modeling what we anticipate for food demand to be up until 2050. And you can see there were 5 categories here, the different colors. The SSPs are shared socioeconomic pathways, and so they were just different scenarios that the studies used to forecast how things will go. For instance, one of them had to do with how well we do it with sustainability. One of them is kind of forecasting business as usual, not much change in sustainability. And then another one plays that scenario where inequality kind of stays the same or improves. And so then you can see the thick lines there are the average of all those different scenarios. But overall, the forecast is 30 to 62% by 2050. And I feel like a lot of times I heard, 100% increase, and it's not quite as bad as that, but still significant. So our options for addressing this food demand, one is food loss. And that's not insignificant, 20% in sub-Saharan Africa and Southeast Asia. And the other one is to intensify productivity. And so that's what we're going to talk about mostly. And when we start thinking about intensifying productivity, one place we go immediately usually is yield gaps, because we're all very familiar with potential yield and what farmers actually attain in yields. And so just to make sure we're all on the same page, these potential yields that we're talking about are, best management practices and effective pest management, weed and insect control, pathogen control, and farmers rarely get to that level, especially in developing countries. And so that gap between what they achieve and what's possible is what we're talking about. And so here's some examples of the yield gap. A lot of them are right about half. Here's an example of maize in Malawi, 4.1 tons per acre versus potential of 8. And actually, that's a little bit high. If you kind of survey yields across Africa, it's usually in the 1.5 to 2.5 range. So rice in Southeast Asia, a gap of 42 to 50 and 55% in irrigated and rain-fed rice, and then cassava in East Africa, a little bit less than half, 8.6 tons compared to a potential of 20.8. And so what accounts for this gap? Because clearly we've got the research that shows we can have much higher yields. And so my question then would be, is it extension? Is there a problem with extension? Because there's clearly information that will attain these higher yields, but for some reason, farmers don't have what it takes to reach these yields. So is there a problem with extension? And I would say there's not really. It's not really the fault of extension. It's the complexity involved with farmers' ability to access these technologies and what the choices they make to use them or not. And so to go through those examples again and point out the complexity here, the maize in Malawi, they faulted low weed control on that, but that was associated with poor households, less educated farmers, and farmers who didn't have income off the farm versus their peers who did have other income sources, for some reason able to either hire more labor for more weed control, but better resource farmers were able to achieve yields closer to the potential. In the case of the rice in Asia, it wasn't studied in that particular exam and this study, and that's actually a problem in and of itself. There was another review study here that looked at 62 yield gap studies. And of those, only 13% included these other variables. Most of them usually talk about the actual biological or abiological causes of the yield gap. And it's just more complex to study those issues, and not to fault this study particularly, because they actually intended to set out to get a very broad and close picture of what the actual yield gaps were. So it wasn't their intent, but there still seems to be a gap in the literature on these other more complex variables. And then the one of cassava in East Africa, that was again lower weed control and also late planting, labor shortages, and that again was associated with poor farmers. And so there's a myriad of variables here. I listed just a short list of variables that are causing these gaps for poor farmers and for also smallholder farmers. And the other issue here, so all these are at play in the value chain for why farmers either have access to technologies or decide to adopt them or not adopt them. But also, we're not concerned with just yield. If we're talking about sustainability, we need to be thinking about more than just yield. There's sustainable intensification. So to intensify sustainably, we need to be considering all these other factors. And so these were established by, I think, USAID in combination with some of the CG centers, the indicators of sustainable intensification. And so you can see, in addition to yield and farm economics and environment, we've got human conditions, so human nutrition and social well-being, things like education for children. So if any of these are being neglected, and we're focusing on one or the other in the group, we're not going to be able to sustainably intensify society or smallholders as a broad group. So it needs to be all of these. And in that case, it's going to take more than extension. It can't be the role of just extension to address all of these components. And so let's move on to talking a little bit more about extension. And we'll just kind of go through the history and evolution of it here. And it goes from, let me back up. So we've got top down, bottom up extension, and then integrated. And probably the biggest or well-known example of top down extension models was the training and visit model. And then maybe the most well-known one for a bottom up type of model is the farmer field schools that came next. And now building on all of those and bringing in a lot of other factors are these integrated systems. And so examples of those are these ag innovation systems or ag research for development. So let's go back to kind of the history of extension in developing nations. And when I started reading about extension in these countries, one of the first things I noticed or read about was the separation between the research entities and the extension. Research is usually being done by some independent institute or government-funded institute or the universities, and then extension is often under the Ministry of Agriculture, and there's very little interaction between the two. And I just read about this over and over again and didn't understand where it came from. Well, it came from these systems that were set up by the colonial governments of these nations. For whatever reason, they established them separately. These research centers and the departments of ag doing extension were set up separately. And extension really in the colonies was focused on maximizing the export products and revenues for the colony. And it's even worse than that. It was black extension and white extension. There were extension systems just for the black farmers and extension systems for white farmers. And those extension systems for white farmers obviously were aimed at maximizing revenues for the colony. But for black farmers, it was about agriculture, but even more so, it was about social engineering and staving off any possible revolutions for independence and keeping everything under control. And also the assumption was, from these research centers and the perspective of extension, that if there's innovation that's good for a white farmer, it's got to be good for a black farmer also. So we shouldn't worry about it. All innovation is useful for all farmers. And so this just created this culture or way of doing business that was top down, supply driven. So supply driven meaning the researchers deciding what ought to be researched and supplying that without the input of farmers. But as these nations gained independence, they did shift from focusing on those export crops to the crops that were important and meaningful to smallholder farmers. But that structure of top down just couldn't be overcome, or just it was hard to start over, and so that was retained. So now to talk about the top down model, the training and visit, established by the World Bank and officially started being funded in 1974. And this really came out of the Green Revolution. We were getting these huge increases in yields in rice and wheat. And the World Bank looked at it and others and said, well, we need an extension system to match these gains that we're getting in yield. We ought to be able to take these technologies, these varieties, and if we have a big enough extension system, we ought to be able to get all farmers growing at this level. And so the idea was just to kind of grid off the countryside with extension agents. And so the structure of it was a multi-layered management system where, like I said, it was just they would just grid out the countryside and get extension agents to everywhere, and then regular visits. So both regular training for the field agents, which was actually just passing off the message from the scientists to pass on to the farmers, and then regular biweekly visits to contact farmers, which was a designated role within the system. These contact farmers were expected then to pass off the message to their neighbors and peers. And this was well intentioned because prior to, there wasn't this regular interaction between extension and farmers. And so this was, the intentions were good, and also dedicated field agents. This was a significant improvement, because under extension of these newly independent nations, a lot of times the ag extension agent was actually the agent or government representative for several different things. And so they were looking at census taking and other government duties, and they were often answering to multiple departments. And so lots of times agriculture fell by the wayside. So T&V attempted to address that. But as you might imagine, that was pretty expensive. And the World Bank really expected this just to take off and be instituted by countries as they pull their funding out. They believed that their system would remain, but like I said, it was just so expensive, so much staff and so much regular transportation for that staff. Most countries just couldn't maintain it, or it was just reduced significantly, the level and reach of the system. And they even, you can read about it, and they were aware that we did need bottom-up aspects to it, that we needed farmer feedback, but it was just so difficult to overcome. And so it just mostly ended up still being a top-down approach. And there were mechanisms, on paper for evaluation and feedback from farmers, but in reality, it just didn't occur like it needed to. So coming out of that, this recognition that we really need to focus on farmer feedback and participation, the farmer field schools were developed. This was initiated, so it's hands-on and experiential learning, and initiated by FAO, Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, first in Indonesia, to deal with the significant outbreaks of brown plant hopper that they were having there. And that was a result of this green revolution, chemical intensive agriculture that they were having. They were having, getting on the pesticide treadmill and having real issues with the hopper and the viruses and diseases that it vectored. And so as a result, it didn't have the widespread impact that everyone hoped it would, but for where it was instituted and successful, it did decrease pesticide use and increase yield. And a major improvement was it's just education of farmers, because the mindset was that all bugs were bad. And so they had no qualms with spraying everything and killing everything. And so it really increased their awareness of beneficials. Farmer field schools are now in 90 countries, and FAO reports that there's 0.4 to 1 million farmers that participate each year. And a lot of them are still focused on IPM, but really the idea is to bring in innovations that are relevant locally to the farming systems there, and allow farmers to interact with those, to try them, and with the help of technical advisors, adapt them or modify them to fit their needs. And like I said, the overall goal is to allow them to try these things in a low risk setting, right? They're not investing and putting a lot of their own capital at risk by trying these things. And this is what allows it also to be bottom up. They're reporting back to farmers and they're reporting back to researchers and communicating about what's working and what's not. And the structure of a farmer field school is a side-by-side comparison of the conventional system and plots or fields trying the new innovations. This role of facilitator is the key role in a farmer field school. And this is a trained agent, and then oftentimes a lead farmer who's been through it and successful at it, and or an NGO. This person just really needs to be motivated and have good communication skills. So it's a really key role. And of course, they are supported by technical advisors, by researchers also. And a lot of times those technical advisors are brought in at different points during the season. It's 20 to 30 farmers throughout a production season. And then oftentimes, or most of the time, they break into smaller groups that are discussing and debating management options, and then making a selection, and then also, I read about certain ones that will give, the groups will give presentations, and the other groups will see what choices that other groups are making, and be able to watch the results of those choices. And as I was reading about this, I thought, this is sounds very familiar to a couple things that happened here in Nebraska. The UNL TAPS program and the On-Farm Research Network are kind of like farmer field schools, where farmers at pretty low risk are able to try new things and see other people, what the choices they are making and the results of all of those things. And so I thought it was an interesting comparison. A lot of times, the funding was primarily by FAO, and then now other groups, USAID funds them, but it's always usually temporary. And so there are a lot of stories of these being continued by farmer co-ops and NGOs or community-based development organizations. There's some criticisms of farmer field schools, though, so we need to be aware of so that we can make them more successful. These quality facilitators they can be a real weak link. So to get a good facilitator is very important. And then the diffusion to non-participants, that's been disappointing a lot of times. We always expect in the T&V and this, we hope and expect that, information will diffuse out to other growers, but it is oftentimes disappointing. And then another criticism is that these really attract progressive farmers that want to try new things. And poor farmers who are just, again, like in the yield gaps, they're just less resourced to participate in these things. And so there's one criticism of them is that they need to be targeting the poorest farmers above all to get them involved. But it's still an important development. It established this precedent for bottom-up extension and participatory extension with farmers. But now this is still mainly about yield and farm economics. And there's so many other factors that are coming into play that still make it still a farmer influences a farmer's access to these innovations or their choice to use them or not. And so that's why we're moving more towards these integrated systems. And you can see Kelly is in the way here. Yeah, yes, right. AR4D. I've crossed out extension because it's beyond what extension can tackle just on its own. It's all actors within the value chain of agriculture. And so these are ag development models. Here they are. Ag innovation systems or agricultural research for development. These are just frameworks that we use in these models. And I was thinking about it as I was driving here. I'm not really sure the difference between the two, other than USAID has been talking about ag innovation systems, and the CGIAR centers have been talking about AR4D. And from everything I read, they're describing the same thing. But the thing to really wrap your head around these is that they don't stop. They're ongoing. It's a new paradigm, a new way of doing business. So, a development project, there's a start and stop, right? A grant funds a project for 3, 5, 10 years at the most. And this is a concept of, just like extension is never ending, right? Is ongoing. This model, this is ongoing participation from all actors that have anything to do with the ag value chain. So here they are listed out. Research and extension, input suppliers and processors, purchasers. Government policy plays a big role because, whatever they choose to promote or to discount or fund has major impacts on the choices that farmers make. And so it's just the interaction of all these players and their influence on, in one way or another, on the choices that farmers make and the access they have to these new innovations. And so it's aimed at, we're thinking about sustainable intensification with that goal in mind. It's aimed at the creation, adaptation, application of these new innovations and scaling them. And as I was thinking about it, I thought this is really kind of like integrated pest management for ag development. It's looking at all the factors, all the variables and how they interact, and drawing on different players or different actors at different times to achieve the goal that we're looking for. And the other thing that these models are intended to do is still bridge this gap. There's still this gap between what's possible with researchers and what they're finding, and farmers and what they're actually doing on the farm. And so it's intended to bridge that gap in the middle, which is here's a graphic representation of this. Is difficult to read, a little bit small, but this is the basic outline of research for development, but the different separated steps. And so there's usually one end of it is research and one end of it is development, and that's gap in the middle. And so, but the other thing that these models are really trying to do is continual learning at the end. So we're constantly monitoring the impacts that are being had at the end of the process. And that is constantly informing what's going on at the beginning. And so there's this continual revolving door of continually monitoring and learning from the impacts at the end, and having that inform our research agendas at the start of the process. And then, like the Farmer Field School, this really requires a quality facilitator. And this isn't one person. This is an entity in the middle of all this, a conductor of the orchestra, to get all of these actors working together and pulling on the right strings at the right time. So easy, no problem, right? But a key part of these ag innovation systems is partnerships within the effort. And so that's where we're going here towards the end. Partnerships within these new models. But I want to pause right here and kind of give a personal testimony as to why I'm thinking about this, because like Dr. Hines said, I made a hard right turn in my career here. And so this was several years ago. I got in two random conversations with two different gentlemen who worked for these kind of organizations. One was in Chile, one was from Bangladesh, and these are Americans. And, you know, we're talking about agriculture, and they say, and I'm a rice agronomist at this time in the middle of Kansas. And they say, you got any ideas for what we could do, or issues? Do we see people struggling with this or that? And, you know, what do you think, or you have any advice? And I came away from those conversations thinking something is really wrong if they are asking a random agronomist in the middle of Kansas about issues half a world away. There's a significant breakdown. And I thought they just have no idea the amount of research and the amount of expertise that's out there. And they, you know, they have no background in agriculture at all, and they have no concept of interfacing with these resources. And so I became possessed with this question of how, obviously they're willing to get involved somehow. And they're, you know, a lot of these organizations are pretty well funded. There's got to be some way to enable them to participate in this, because if they're willing, why not make use of them? Because they're everywhere. They're this existing network to utilize. And so I became so possessed with it that it led to the DPH program at this late stage in life. And also the creation of a 501c3 a few years ago, Eastgate Extension. And so the purpose of this is to facilitate somehow between these community-based development organizations and research, and enable the two to form partnerships to help smallholders. And so from here on is kind of like Dr. Hines said, my business plan of how I think Eastgate Extension can contribute to this gap. And so first we'll talk about complementarity between research and these community-based organizations. And I would argue that within these ag innovation systems, ag research for development, that these are the two main players, the most important players, research and these community-based development organizations. And I guess I would lump research, I would lump extension in with research, because research, I mean, extension is an entity within this, but extension is also something we're doing. And so both of these groups are doing extension. And so, you know, they're pulling in the same direction. And like I said, these organizations are just scattered everywhere. And I'm finding more and more of them that are interested in getting involved in agriculture. And so early on, I got connections actually with Africa Rising and ended up doing an internship with them for the DPH program. And Kelly's in the way again. That's right, we got most of it. This project, which is funded by USAID's Feed the Future program. Truman, are you falling asleep? Okay. It's funded by USAID's Feed the Future program, but managed by IITA, International Institute of Tropical Ag, which is one of the CGIAR centers. It's based in Nigeria. I got connected with them. There was a group in Tanzania that was interested in getting involved in agriculture. I had some connections at IITA, and I said, what do you guys have going in Tanzania? And they said, oh, the Africa Rising program. So got connected with Africa Rising, and then ended up being able to do an internship with them. And so the two main components that Africa Rising was, they were trying to do this very thing, to bridge this gap between research and whatever organization is in the community who could help spread that research out. But first, they wanted to target, they saw research occurring in silos. And so they first set out to integrate this research, and also with in the forefront of their mind, innovations that farmers are interested in, farmer-driven technologies. And so they just weren't, it wasn't just the top-down approach of finding good research and getting it to farmers. They were cognizant of what farmers were looking for when they were assessing the existing research. And so then that was the first phase of the project. And then the second phase, 5 years each. The second phase was building these relationships between themselves and the researchers and these development actors, whatever organization in the community. And so, I went into my relationship with them wanting to get my brain around how this process works, how a development project would work with a community-based organization. And so, my conversations with them, I really kind of ended up discussing the complementarity between the two groups. And so we're going to go through the basic components of a development project and quick examples of what both research contributes, how they complement the work of a community-based organization, how the community-based organization, probably more importantly, complements the work that researchers are trying to do. So the first is baseline assessments. This is just getting a snapshot of where we are currently, existing yields and demographics of the farmers currently. And then the role of researchers within this is designing survey and statistical analysis, the community-based organization, and really in all of these components of this, it's their position within the community, their position within society, and their perspective on farmers' lives and farmers' operations that makes them a good partner. And so I listed here their relationships in the community and their connections, and how they organize, how they can organize within the community, getting the word out and getting farmers interested. Technology development. So this is the research trials and validation of research. And of course, obviously within this is researchers doing the trials, but also them making assessments of the production system and seeing what types of issues or research are relevant to those production systems. But we can't just rely on them to make those assessments. Then that's where the community development organizations come in. They can help give perspective to researchers on farmers' perspectives and market priorities. Integrating new innovations. So this is on-farm experimentation and more importantly, adapting those innovations to work cohesively within the existing system. And then, so researchers are serving here with technical guidance and support. And then importantly, CBDOs are bolstering the feedback that farmers can give, because they just have a different perspective than researchers can have. And so they can offer these different insights. There's all those variables that we were talking about. Those are looking from the outside in. A lot of those aren't so obvious, but an organization that's in the community consistently has a much better vantage point of those issues. And then this is the major one, monitoring and evaluation. This is measuring rates of farmer adoption and the impacts that that adoption has on sustainable intensification. So here again, researchers are providing evaluation of design and statistics, but importantly, one criticism of monitoring and evaluation a lot of times is that it's just a brief snapshot at the end of the project, and we only see what's happened there immediately. But there's a lot of times that these things are adopted over time. Delayed adoption is one term, and I'm going blank on the other one. But farmers are evolving and adopting these technologies over time, and so it would be very beneficial if there were as an organization in the community that can monitor that process over a decade. Okay, so we've established the complementarity between the two, and we see that there's good reason for partnership with these community-based organizations, but there are, we need to have a certain standard for the organizations if they're going to get involved. And so there's certain expectations that we want to make sure are checked off when we're building these partnerships. And so that's one question I asked Africa Rising. I said, when you're seeking these partnerships, what are you looking for? And I remember very clearly the response was willing and able. And as I had more conversations with them and read more about this, I really started to see 4 different things emerge that are crucial for these organizations to possess to make them good partners. And so these are the 4 here: motivation, funding and staff, relationships, and communication. We'll go through each of these one by one. And what I mean by motivation is a vision and passion. These organizations that I'm talking to see a need and they're feeling burdened to get involved in some way. And so lots of times I've seen in organizations where leadership will get excited about something and then try to delegate that excitement to staff underneath. And that's just a lot of times not very effective. So we want to make sure that these organizations have a culture of interest and excitement in contributing to ag development. And that might be a difficult thing to achieve, especially with an organization that's wanting to get into this as a new aspect to what they're offering to these communities. Funding and staff. I think one big benefit of these organizations is that they're already there, they already exist and are funded. But in a lot of cases, there'll be opportunities for funding as researchers are procuring funding. There's an aspect of those grants that are for the actual extension piece of it. And so I think a lot of them will be able to have some funding to get started. But again, we're talking about the long term here. These ag innovation systems, this is a new paradigm. We're doing things differently going forward. And so these organizations, if they're serious, they need to be planning for the long term and either adding new funding to what they're doing or shifting the priorities of their organization in some way. But staff, I think, in the few that I've been talking with, one thing we initially talk about is you're going to need, if you guys aren't in agriculture, you're going to need the right staff to do this. And here actually I think is an opportunity to hire in the right motivation and passion for agriculture. And then relationships. I think maybe I said this. I think this is one of the most attractive parts to researchers for partnering with these organizations, the relationships that they have in communities, because if they're doing good work, they've got good relationships and they've got trust built within the community. And this is, I think, a really important aspect to researchers. And it just builds this open communication. And it's important for bottom-up participatory approaches. We want honest conversations between farmers and researchers. And so these relationships, I think, facilitate a bottom-up approach. And then communication. The relationships are absolutely critical for the communication. And that was one thing Africa Rising talked about. You have to make clear from the start the roles and responsibilities of each side. And so communication is vital there. And then they also emphasized, we want the partners to have a very complete and deep understanding of the innovations and how they interact in smallholder systems. And so communication is key there. And then also relaying farmer feedback. One tripping point a lot of times is farmers being supported by these projects in some way and wanting this research projects or development projects to continue. And so when they're reporting back results, a lot of times they make it look better than it is. And so they don't quite get honest responses from farmers. And so I think these organizations on the ground can really see what's happening and offer honest evaluations. Okay, so assuming we've got a quality community-based development organization that checks all of those boxes, motivated, communication relationships, how do they get started? What are the next steps? And that's what we're going to talk about here. I think there's three major ones. Obviously, it's much more complicated than this, but these are three key ones that can't be skipped over. First, understanding the issues, an overview of the existing work, and then getting to work, establishing a project. And what I mean by understanding the issues, what do we know? What do we think we know? And what do we not know? So what I thought of when I was going through this, we've all experienced that, driving by a field and you think you know what's happening out there. There's certain things that you can know, like, growth stage, things like that. But there's other things that you assume about what's happening in the field. But if you actually get out and go walk through it, there's a lot more that you're going to find out. And so that's what I mean here. These organizations they see what's happening in the community. So there's certain things that they definitely know, and there's certain things that they could probably make a reasonable assumption about, but they've got to take the time to understand what's actually happening there. And this is where these relationships and communication are so necessary to get to the bottom of what farmers are dealing with. And then an overview of existing work. I can just guarantee in any of these communities that these organizations are operating in, there has been a project at one time or currently is a project. And so to me, it's really important to find out what's happened or what's happening currently, and who's doing it. What are the organizations that are doing it? And then also, there are extensive extension systems. They need to be in conversations with the extension services that are there. And this is just a graphic representation of all those organizations. These are the organizations that we're trying to build partnerships with for these community-based organizations. And these are the ones that, those two gentlemen I had those initial conversations with, have never heard of. The organizations I'm talking about, probably have no idea that these groups, these research entities exist. So, and then establishing a project. So what type of project? The two basic or obvious examples are the Farmer Field School, and there's resources for how to set these up and guide them, guidance documents or demonstration farms. And here really, this question should probably be posed to farmers themselves and to researchers, because the researchers doing work in that area have seen what projects have been successful or unsuccessful. And then obviously, we want a bottom-up participatory approach. So we need to be asking farmers what would help them. But above all, location is really important, primarily for farmers, because they're going to be, however they're interacting with this project, they're going to be walking to it, especially, the poorest ones. Some might have a motorbike to get there quicker, but there's so many that will be walking. And so it has to be convenient for them, but it also has to be convenient for the organization itself, the person managing these trials or demonstrations, because I personally, the field that's 10 minutes away, I see a lot more often than the field that's 30 or 40 minutes away. And so we want quality management of these projects. And so it needs to be convenient for them also. So here is another personal case study or testimony. Like I said, I got connected with Africa Rising a few years ago, and that was through conversations that I was having with a person at a CBDO, anonymous CBDO in Tanzania. And so this person was telling me, kind of the vision that this organization had. They have several adult education centers across Tanzania, that they're training people in certain areas, and they wanted to add agricultural training to this. And so in my conversations with Africa Rising, it sounded like a perfect fit, because Africa Rising were looking for organizations and, more importantly, sites to set up demonstrations and training on these technologies. And so I I petitioned Africa Rising. I said, this is what this organization has and what they're wanting to do. Do you feel like this is worth having a conversation with them about potential partnership? And they said, yeah. So I arranged a meeting between the two and traveled to Tanzania. And also I had connections there. Their main ag university is Sokoine University of Agriculture in Morogoro. And so I had some connections there. So we scheduled to stop on their research farm. And so here's just a few pictures from them. This is at Sokoine University. Here closest to us is a researcher at Sokoine and the research farm director there. And the other two gentlemen are leadership of that organization. And it was just so interesting to me to watch this interaction. This is papaya here in the front and then pineapple next and banana in the background. But it was amazing to me that, these gentlemen knew of Sokoine, but had never been there, didn't know anybody at the university. And here they were, considering agriculture. And this is just a relationship that there has to be some connection here. Has to be some connection established. And so it was just amazing. You could tell their eyes were opened about, what's going on in their own country. And so it was a lot of fun. This was a post-harvest project that they were in partnership with USAID Feed the Future Horticultural Innovation Lab that's managed by University of California, Davis. And then we also made a few visits to their sites, to their schools, and they're all in far-flung places, and land is not an issue for them. They're pretty well funded, and land is always available, especially if you have funds. And so each of their sites were at least 10 hectares, 20 or 30, one of them, and then they could get more very easily. And when we visited these sites, at each of them, the leadership at those individual sites had also been thinking about what could be done with that land as far as education. So that I keyed onto that real quick. Here's local buy-in at the lower levels of the organization, and with the higher levels of the organization thinking about it also. So it was. Then we ended up in Arusha, where ITA Africa Rising Project is, on the campus of the World Vegetable Center. It was a good meeting. They talked about their visions. Each side talked about their vision and what they wanted to achieve, and it all made sense. And this was in January of 2020, and so I came back to a week late for my starting semester, and then we started hearing about a virus coming out, and so that's where this conversation kind of ended for them. This organization, obviously refocused on dealing with managing the virus in Tanzania. So and Africa Rising staff dispersed back. Most of them went back to their. I think maybe one or two are native Tanzanians. But so to conclude, I think these two, research and extension on one side and community-based development organizations, are the most important of these ag innovation systems. And these groups are asking how they can get involved, and we need to figure out some way to enable them to do so. Acknowledgements first, Rachel and our kids. This was not a convenient time to do a DPH in my stage in life, and so I want to thank her. There were a lot of times I thought, I'm not sure this is right, because there's some sacrifices being made. They're making some sacrifices, and I, wasn't always comfortable with it, but we've made it through. And then I want to assign blame to Roger Elmore, because we started talking early on. Someone introduced me to him, and he'd been thinking about these things for a long time, decades even, and introduced me to Dr. Hine. And so it's really his fault that I had to do this at this late stage in life. And then thanks to Dr. Hine, because it was complicated doing it at this stage in life, and we found ways to be more remote a lot of times, and make some exceptions, especially during COVID, doing some internships during COVID. So he was very supportive and helpful in that way. So the end. We'll have a conversation now. I went a little bit over, but hopefully we can talk about some of it, because like these systems, this isn't set. I'm evolving, and we're adapting this, and I don't have all the answers. So Yeah. There'll be notifications here, right, on the chat. See who's on. 2 Callie's. Oh, everybody's seeing relinquished.
I'm curious about the yield gap that we talked about at the beginning. Mentioned that shared tube examples of the Saba difference of 20 and 8. So those studies established that upper limits. Are those established within the context of sustainable intensification, or are those just maximum possible yields in that environment?
We'd have to look at each of those individually. I would imagine if you did a survey or did a review of all studies, you'd see the range of effort given to sustainable intensification. I would say, like we were seeing there, that a lot of them aren't paying attention to those social factors and other more complex variables. I would say probably I would guess a majority of them aren't looking at, because it's so complicated. And if we're just trying to get do some research and get a publication out or to get to some conclusion, we have to cut ourselves off somewhere. And so I would suspect that I haven't, I'm sure I could find some that are doing it, but.
Typically, a good place to start looking for
Fertility and soil management. You just see that over and over again. Low fertility, soil erosion. And then next, probably weed control. I see mentioned most often. And then not far after that, and probably a tie between insect and pathogens. But fertility seems to be the major issue. And along with that, probably variety selection or access to other varieties. But yes, sir. Yeah. Yeah, so I forgot I was supposed to repeat the questions here. The first question was about what biotic factors are most significant with regard to the yield gap, what's contributing to that yield gap most. And now the question is the cost and expense of addressing those issues, and how feasible or how possible it is to address those issues with considering the resources of smallholders. And that's tough too, because these projects, well, one, companies and government policy or subsidies make chemicals a lot more accessible, and fertilizer accessible, but there's a lot of sustainability oriented management that's being looked at and discussed. So, practices to conserve soil and improve fertility. And there's so much burning of plant matter and feeding it to livestock. And so there's you see a lot of projects dealing with that, other ways of utilizing other resources for livestock and educating on soil health and soil management. And that's going to address, that soil fertility aspect. And then as far as pest control, I kept seeing it with regard to weeds. So a lot of labor intensity. I get the impression that if farmers are going to spend anything, it's usually on chemicals. It's usually going to be pest or insect and disease control, and then weed control is done manually a lot of times, from what I can tell. And so a couple of those examples were, that the wealthier farmers had better access to labor or could afford labor. And so I'm getting lost in the question now. Right. Right. Yeah, that's a good one. I don't know. I think it seems like if they can see what's possible and they can experience that it's possible, it goes a long way, because it's one thing, just talking about it and showing it. But these farmer field schools, I think, are a good example. They're actually doing it themselves and seeing that it's possible. So yeah, did I get state your last part of your question one more time? The personal motivation. Yeah. 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 That's a question for those community-based development organizations. Yeah, because that's not addressed a lot in the literature of why they make the choices that they do. The times that I do see it discussed is either they don't want to take the risk, and there's lots of efforts to mitigate that risk on their behalf. So different insurance mechanisms that are becoming more and more available to farmers, so that they can adopt some of these practices and have insurance that if it doesn't go right. So I would, just a surface view of it, I think risk is maybe the biggest motivating factor. And then also what's convenient and what they already know. And it's just easier kind of to stick with what you have. Like in the instance of IPM, it's complex, and it takes a lot of learning and paying attention. And I don't want to say that I don't want to. Well, I don't know. It's either it's more profitable, or they perceive it as more profitable. Maybe it's not always, but I would guess a lot of it's perception. So let's go ahead and do the oral exam now. I think we're getting into it a little bit. Or just go ahead and burn all your questions up. Yep, there's 3 here. Okay, hopefully I repeated questions well enough. Is that repeat? Okay, repeat the questions. So what we were just discussing here was what the question was, what motivations or what incentives, what's influencing farmers' choice to adopt or not adopt questions. Ali says, great presentation. You guys can read it. So, struck by the history of extension you shared, could you speculate on how your framework or partnering with researchers and CBDOs could repair some of the harm caused by historical injustices in these organizations? No. I think the biggest thing is empowering farmers. These organizations, and I think I had it in my notes, but I didn't mention it. We've got a facilitator in the middle of these ag innovation systems, somebody that's conductor pulling the strings of all the different stakeholders within the ag value chain. And I think researchers are, so all the players within that hodgepodge of actors, most of them are motivated by their own work, right? They're concerned with themselves and their profitability. So the processor, the input suppliers, the processors, right, and rightfully so, because if they're not going to be in business. So they have to prioritize their own existence first. But within all those groups, even more so than policymakers and politicians, I think CBDOs are motivated purely by the interests of the farmer, and researchers also. researchers have to deal with, also staying in business to a degree, publishing and getting results. But these CBDOs, they want to stay in business too, but the reason for being in business is promoting the cause of these communities. And so I think, to answer your question, Allie, I think these organizations are in there with motivations for the community themselves, and that's how they are contributing to repairing these injustices. They are purely motivated by improving the lives and livelihoods of smallholders. Okay, I think that was it. Allie had the hardest question. You bet. Thanks everybody for getting online.